Welcome, everyone. I'm Mian from the Princeton program on Science and Global Security, and I am also one of the co-founders of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction and serve on its steering committee. So I'm pleased to welcome everyone to this webinar where we are going to talk about some of the key issues that have emerged and confront efforts to deal with US nuclear policy and nuclear threat reduction at this time. The purpose of the webinar is to share views from leading experts in our community on current and emerging crises with regard to nuclear threat reduction efforts in the United States and opportunities for progress on this agenda. And we're also hoping to introduce some of the near-term nuclear policy advocacy goals of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And just to make sure that we are all familiar with the Physicists Coalition, the Physicists Coalition was founded in 2019 at the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security as a way to organize work by physical scientists in the United States and more broadly to learn more about and reduce the threats from nuclear weapons and to mobilize advocacy within the physical science communities in the United States and globally, the aim being to challenge the civilization-ending potential of the use of nuclear weapons. And to that end, we advocate for substantive changes in nuclear arsenals, force postures, and declaratory policies with a view to fulfillment of the long-standing international obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. And this is part of a very long tradition of work by physicists going all the way back to some of the people who were in the Manhattan Project to address the dangers of nuclear weapons and to engage both other physicists, policymaking processes, and the public on this set of questions. So for today's webinar, I'm pleased to welcome our speakers and briefly note the outline of the events. Our first speaker will be Hans Kristensen from the Federation of American Scientists, who's going to talk about US nuclear weapon programs. And then Laura Grego from the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists will talk about the US Iron Dome program that was announced by President Trump recently. And then we're going to have Xiaodon and Liang from the Arms Control Association, which is one of the partners of the Physicists Coalition, talking about opportunities for arms control talks as we look at the rest of 2025 and going forward, keeping in view President Trump's suggestion of possible talks on denuclearization, reducing nuclear weapons, and cutting military budgets together with Russia and China. And finally, our last speaker will be Stuart Prager, who is the chair of the steering committee of the Physicists Coalition, and he's going to talk about the advocacy goals that the coalition has adopted for the near term for 2025. And then we're going to have time at the end for Q&A. So with that, let me hand it over to our first speaker, Hans Kristensen, to make his opening remarks. Hans, over to you.
Thank you, Zia, and thanks very much for the invitation. And so I've been given 15 minutes here to talk about broad outlines of US nuclear weapons programs, modernizations, and policies and strategies. So I'll do all of that in 15 minutes. So the first entry here, of course, on changes or status and changes of posture and policies. I think I'm going to back up a bit and to start with the modernization program because it's going to lead into that. And here, the key issues, of course, are, as you're probably well familiar, this sort of massive, literally across-the-board modernization program that has been underway now since, 2010 plus. And what we're seeing now are the big programs. You might remember a decade or so ago, there was a big debate about the so-called bow wave in investments for the nuclear modernization program. And that's what we're seeing beginning to happen for real now. And so we're seeing the huge programs with the Sentinel, the ICBM, which is in deep trouble. They've had massive overruns. I mean, doubling of cost, and the program is in shambles because of mismanagement and miscontracting, and right now they're not even sure how fast they can get this started. There's a whole new review. They've stopped production or construction on some of the first launch control centers. And so there's a completely new review going on of this. It's not about the missile itself, it's about the infrastructure. And so one of the consequences of that, of course, is that now it is very likely that the existing Minuteman III is going to have to operate beyond 2050. This used to be a program that was absolutely impossible to life extend beyond 2035, and here we are. Then there's the Columbia class submarine. Construction is already underway. The first one will go on patrol in 2031. We're talking about 12 boats with the option to produce more after. But this is not a program that can speed up or, produce more off quicker, etc. Also a very expensive program, already delayed to such an extent that they're now thinking about, or been talking for several years now, about extending the life of the first 5 of the class, the existing Ohio class submarine, to bridge that gap. Then there's the B-21 bomber, which is probably the only sort of bright spot, at least officially, on the modernization program, because it is in full production now. The first batch is under construction. We've had several flight tests. Things have gone well. That thing is supposed to start coming in here in a couple of years, and with that comes a new air-launched nuclear cruise missile, which is also under development. It has a modified warhead from the existing air-launched cruise missile. One of the consequences of the B-21, because it's replacing the B-1, is that we will see an expansion of nuclear bomber bases in the United States from the current 2 to 3, 2 actual bases, to 5 bases. So they're building nuclear storage facilities at several other bases that had the B-1 bomber, and also reinstating it at Barksdale. This is going to be a big change for the bomber force. Lurking there is the big question of how many are they going to have as nuclear capable? What's the requirement here? The total production is going to be over 100 of these bombers, at least that's their dream. But how many of those are going to be nuclear? Then the strategic bomb B-61-12 has been introduced, and it's in the stockpile now, and it's replacing the old B-61-7 strategic bomb. There's some debate about whether it should have a new Earth penetrator to replace the B-61-11. There's no decision yet, but there's no life extension for that system. And there is now a phase 1 study underway at NNSA that's going to look into a possible alternative for that. There's another study also that's talking about a warhead for what they call a non-reentry vehicle ballistic missile warhead. So you can try to figure out how many ways you can do that, but it probably refers to some kind of a hypersonic glide vehicle warhead. No details about it yet. On the tactical side, we have the F-35 that has come in, fighter jet, and now the B-61-12 in the tactical version is now fully forward deployed, as they say, in Europe. So it's gone to the bases over there, and as far as I can get from them, it means that it's there. It's at all the location. They've done that. They switched the weapons, and the old ones have come home. And so that's where we are now. With the tactical nuclear system, the most important one is the addition of the Lakenheath Air Base to the nuclear-capable mission in Europe. It used to have a nuclear mission, then it was mothballed, and now it's being reinstated in full swing, close to completion. The next one is the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, where, of course, they have a plan to field that. Even on the best of circumstances, so to speak, this will not come in until the mid 2030s. There's a lot of work to do on that system. Then, of course, there's the whole nuclear command and control modernization. We don't hear so much about it. it's sort of very classified, but it's everything from terminals on launchers and ground stations to the TACAMO, Navy aircraft to communicate with the submarines. The Air Force wants to have their own, so we're going to see the spin-off of an air-based nuclear command and control aircraft in the near future, et cetera. So all of these things are piling up and costing money, and as you can hear, delays and cost overruns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe nothing new here, but that's the way it goes. It does mean that these timelines they had for this, the cost projections, and on also this claim about there's no margin for error, there's no margin for delay, is all bullshit. I mean, they can drive this and tweak it any way they want. Then there's the question of maintenance. If you could sort of the infrastructure, the facilities, the production facilities. And here, of course, the biggest item is the pit production facility, or facilities. Two facilities, one in Los Alamos, one in Savannah River, both behind budget, behind the schedule, over budget. Most likely not going to be ready to meet the requirement until mid-2030s. If even that, I mean, I would not be surprised if we see more delays. And this is to produce at least 80 pits per year. And the first requirement for that pit is the new warhead, the B-61, the B-87-1, the new warhead for the ICBM. And then, of course, there's the operations at Pantex, which is like operations of surveillance of warheads, maintenance, disassembly, and reassembly, and of course, production of the new warheads that come in. And so they just finished the B-61-12. Now they're moving on, or continuing with the air-launched cruise missile warhead, and moving on to the ICBM warhead, the W-87-1. And there's a whole stream of warheads after that as well. There are new replacement warheads for the submarines, the W-93. There's a new air-launched warheads in the cards further into the future. And the important part here is that the warhead surveillance program and production program has shifted from the life extension programs that we used to have after the end of the Cold War. That was a way to extend the types of warheads we already have, not build new ones, but sort of redo what we have. They're moving away from that now. And so now they're shifting into sort of a real new warhead production era again. And so that's going to color and characterize nuclear modernization from now on. There's been some suggestions about nuclear testing, resumption of nuclear testing. You're familiar there in Trump 1, they tried to sort of beef up the readiness, shorten the readiness timeline for nuclear testing in case somebody wanted to set one off. There's no interest in the military, no interest in the laboratories to do that. They want the money for something else. But we have political figures in the Trump administration that sort of begin to talk about this. And in Trump 2 here, we're beginning to hear some real chatter about not just shortening the readiness, but an actual test. And this is not at the top level yet. It's sort of at a medium level of people doing this. And I think it's more have to do with we're expecting anything from the Trump administration, so better get ready for this. So no certainty on this yet, but you can bet that's going to be something coming. Changes in posture and policies. Well, here we have the Biden administration finished the new guidance for the nuclear employment guidance for how the military should plan for nuclear operations. They did that just shortly before they left. And there was a lot of misreporting about that guidance, that it shifted the focus to China. That's not the case. Nor is there a requirement in the guidance for being able to fulfill all the objectives, the presidential objectives at once against all, both Russia and China and North Korea. Yes, I know it says in the guidance to do deterrence at all three at the same time. But we're already doing that. We've already been doing that, for decades. But there's no overall shift to focus on China yet. The Biden administration is out. The Trump administration will come in, and one of their first tasks will be to do a nuclear posture review. We're hearing that this review will be rushed, most likely not a true interagency review, but basically just a Pentagon review. And that we will see that underway here very shortly, probably to be launched here in March, and then to be concluded before the end of the year. And that's going to capture, or rubber stamp everything they want to do under, what you just heard about. We'll see what new programs come in. One of the challenges, of course, that they would like to stand up to China and these types of things, but and proposals to increase deployed warheads. But the problem for advocates of sort of taking on the Chinese and the Russians more aggressively on nuclear is that there's not very much capacity in the nuclear enterprise to beef up and increase the stockpile, the arsenal significantly, and that has to do with the infrastructure and the way the production has been laid out. You just can't beef up the ICBM production or beef up the submarines, or you may be able to increase the bombers a bit, but that's for later on in the system. So what we're more seeing as sort of modernization ideas on the periphery of the main modernization program, such as the Xiaodon nuclear cruise missile, maybe one or two other sort of symbolic additions for regional operations and things like that, but nothing that rocks the boat. They just don't have the capacity to do that for the next decade. More likely, they're going to be faced with not only that contraction of the production capability and the capacity of the system, but of course also, like I mentioned, these enormous cost overruns and the delays that are really going to pressure the modernization programs as we go forward. So we'll see where we go, but there are a lot of sort of bongo drums going that we need to do this and that, but there's a lot of constraints in the modernization program, but busy nonetheless across the board with all these types of programs. And then most recently, you of course heard about Trump talking sort of in two tongues. On the one hand, the one about being big and strong and not have a tired deterrence and big button and all that kind of stuff. Yet at the same time, also saying he doesn't like a nuclear arms race, and he would like to cut a deal with the Russians in some shape or form. He's even mentioned the word denuclearization. So the question is, what kind of options does that give? Will he pursue it? Will the Russians go along? I think it's likely that both the United States and Russia will cut some kind of a handshake deal that they say we don't need to go to greater numbers in launchers and things like that. But lurking in the background, of course, is China. How are they going to be able to deal with China, relate to China without sort of upsetting an agreement between the United States and Russia? So all of that has to play out. But that's where we are. So that would just be my 5 cents here up front. Looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Hans. And just to add one footnote to that, since Hans mentioned the debate about nuclear weapons testing, a decade ago, the US Department of Energy actually made public the information that a special task force, which included all 3 nuclear weapon laboratory directors and strategic command, had concluded that what they called a very simple test for political purposes, this is a direct quote, a very simple test for political purposes could be conducted in as little as 6 to 10 months, whereas a fully instrumented test because of an actual nuclear warhead issue would take 24 to 36 months, and to develop a new capability might take up to 60 months. And all of this may actually require specific waivers of existing environmental and health and safety procedures to be able to do all of this. But we can come back to that later in the discussion. So let me hand the floor over to our second speaker, Laura Grego from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Laura, please.
Thank you, Zia. So On January 27th, President Trump issued an order entitled Iron Dome for America, and it did a number of things, including mandating the development of a hugely expensive, I would say unrealistic and counterproductive homeland missile defense system to defend against all types of missiles from all types of adversaries. It is an audacious vision, given that over the last 60 years, the United States has spent more than $400 billion on efforts to develop a defense against nuclear-armed ICBMs, an effort that has largely been plagued by false starts and failures, and which has produced systems that have yet to be demonstrated to be effective against a real-world threat. So here's what the executive order says. It sets as policy that the United States will deploy and maintain a next generation missile defense shield to deter and defend its citizens and critical infrastructure against any foreign aerial attack on the homeland, and it will guarantee its second strike capability. And then the order gives implementation instructions, and this is really where the meat of the order is. It asks the Secretary of Defense to provide a reference architecture within 60 days, so by March 27th, that will provide plans for defense of the U.S. against ballistic, hypersonic, advanced cruise missiles, and other next-generation aerial attacks from peer, near-peer, and rogue adversaries. So if there were any questions about what the policy included, it's made clear in the implementation that it is defense essentially against any kind of threat from any kind of adversary. Now, this upends decades of consensus missile defense policy, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The Secretary of Defense architecture needs to include, at a minimum, these elements, among some other things: a space-based sensor layer, space-based boost phase interceptors, and underlayer and terminal phase intercept capabilities to defeat a counter-value attack. This likely means shorter range systems that protect specific sites. Counter-value is understood to be civilian targets, not hardened military targets. So this is likely to be cities and perhaps critical infrastructure. It should also include boost phase defenses, apparently of other kinds than space-based, since space-based was already specified. In development of left of launch capabilities, meaning the ability to disable or destroy missiles before they're launched. And it also asks for the development of non-kinetic capabilities, which I would understand to mean directed energy. So since I just have a short time, I wanted to draw your attention to a few key things. First is the dramatic policy change and its likely effects. Current and long-standing U.S. policy has been that ballistic missile defense is intended to defend the United States homeland from the threat of long-range missiles from Iran or North Korea, but not from the larger and more sophisticated missile arsenals of major nuclear powers, Russia and China. And this reflects long-standing consensus that defending against a sophisticated nuclear arsenal is technically and economically infeasible and also strategically unwise. The U.S. missile defense policy adopted in 1999 stated that the U.S., quote, deploy as soon as technologically possible an effective national missile defense system capable of defending the territory of the United States against limited ballistic missile attack. That is generally understood to be emerging missile threats, primarily North Korea. And while in the past 25 years, Congress has intermittently attempted to amend this policy, Democratic administrations have always pushed back, saying that it would be destabilizing to develop missile defenses to counter the strategic deterrence forces of Russia and China, and eventually required that this be made explicit, that to state that missile defenses were not aimed at Russia and China, and that deterrence was the core means of assuring that those states did not launch missiles. And this policy roughly follows the logic of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was designed to diffuse arms racing between missile offense and defense, and so to permit nuclear arms reductions. If Russia felt that the U.S. could use missile defenses to escape mutual vulnerability, then Russia would invest in more nuclear weapons and vice versa. This logic was also meant to provide crisis stability. If one actor felt protected from retaliation, they may be incentivized to strike first with nuclear weapons. So it's meant to circumvent that tendency. So the new executive order represents a major shift in policy. And what do we expect the consequences of this to be? There will be, and we'll see how they play out. But I should first say that while US policy has been only to build defenses against North Korea, this status quo has also been under pressure from technological advances. The improvement of the ability of the United States to destroy hardened targets with more precisely targeted nuclear weapons, the mastery of persistent overhead imagery to facilitate the tracking and targeting of mobile missiles, the development of conventional weapons that can target command and control facilities and potentially damage missile silos. These are all critical advances that may facilitate a US first strike that would result in a depleted and potentially uncoordinated or ragged retaliatory force that could be conceivably defeated by US missile defenses if they were improved. China and Russia have been concerned that this suite of technologies might indicate a desire to escape mutual vulnerability. And additionally, China's concern is amplified by the fact that the US has not formally accepted mutual vulnerability with China. And evidence supporting this perspective include Russia and China's development of novel nuclear weapons delivery systems and other offensive systems that can avoid, overwhelm, or defeat US ballistic missile defenses, even though that the current systems are not at all capable against their offenses, as well as a vigorous diplomatic strategy to constrain missile defenses and space-based weapons. And Russia has consistently linked further nuclear reductions to limits on missile defenses. And Russia and China have long promoted a treaty banning weapons in space, and that has been interpreted by the US as a means to constrain space-based missile defense systems. US space-based missile defenses have been a nightmare scenario for both Russia and China. And indeed, recently, the Russian Foreign Ministry official Grigory Mashkov wrote that any such move to implement this policy, quote, puts an end to the prospects of strategic offensive arms reduction and preservation of strategic stability on the previous terms. So I'm sure that these reactions will continue to play out and need our attention. The second thing I wanted to draw your attention to are a couple of the technical questions, given we are the Physicists Coalition, and physicists have long been engaged in the technical and strategic debates around missile defense. So of course, using the name Iron Dome is trying to manufacture credibility for this vision, given the popularity of Iron Dome in Israel and its reputation as being a successful system. But however, the apparent successes of Israel's Iron Dome are not particularly relevant to US homeland defense. Iron Dome defends small areas from short-range non-nuclear missiles, such as rockets, artillery, simple short-range homemade systems that travel at speeds about 1 kilometer per second over much smaller distances, about up to 70 kilometers, and they carry non-nuclear warheads. Iron Dome interceptors don't strike incoming missiles directly, but try to approach them and explode, sending out shrapnel. The Iron Dome interceptors are also designed to destroy their targets within the atmosphere, where they can't be fooled by lightweight decoys and other penetration aids that have bedeviled mid-course strategic defenses. So it's a vastly easier task than defending the whole country against nuclear-armed missiles that travel 100 times further, 7 times faster than Iron Dome. And it requires a totally different kind of design and defense. And of course, for homeland missile defense against nuclear missiles, it needs to be very reliable and very effective to be of interest. So I would say Iron Dome is more or less marketing. And we've gotten word this week that instead of Iron Dome, the effort is likely going to be renamed Golden Dome, which might be a better description given how expensive it is likely to be. So the executive order requires plans for a space-based boost phase interceptor systems. And despite investments in research and development on and off over decades, the US does not field any boost phase missile defenses, nor does any other country. The Strategic Defense Initiative concept, or Star Wars, of the 1980s was eventually abandoned as technically infeasible. In the 1990s, the Brilliant Pebbles, its successor, was dismissed mainly because the system would be vulnerable to attack, be very expensive, and it vastly exceeded the space launch capacity of that time. And the core issues from decades ago are still relevant, still the relevant ones informing the usefulness of space-based boost phase missile defense, including technical readiness, cost, complexity, numbers, and vulnerability to asymmetric attack. So the key parameter driving the technical requirements of a boost phase system is a short time available to destroy the target. So for countries that are large geographically, such as China and Russia, which can pull their launch systems far away from their borders, the only way to get close enough to the launching missiles is to be in space. And given the realities of orbital dynamics, even for modestly capable systems against very modest threats, you can expect hundreds of satellites to be required for a space-based kinetic kill boost phase missile defense. And there have been a number of studies in the past 25 years of these concepts of boost phase missile defense against North Korean ICBMs, and those have generally included an examination of space-based concepts. While North Korea is a different case, these can be instructive. North Korea is a simpler case, but we can extrapolate and get some ideas about the scales of these systems. The National Academies of Science and Engineering study in 2012, Making Sense of Missile Defense, assessed that while space-based boost phase defense against North Korean missiles using interceptors is technically possible in principle, it's very expensive, at least an order of magnitude more so than other options, and would also be brittle. Meaning susceptible to salvo launches that would overwhelm the system and would be vulnerable to direct attack of its elements. The recommendation of the National Academies was that the fragility and exceedingly high cost of space-based interceptors and of the relatively meager benefit of what they provide leads it to recommend that they not be considered further. So that time constraint imposed by the boost phase length is a critical parameter. Missiles, the boost phase of missiles can range anywhere from around 3 minutes to 5 minutes, but liquid fueled missiles take longer to boost than solid fuels. And so the advance towards solid fueled missiles will make the requirements of a boost phase system much more challenging. So given North Korea's progress in developing solid propellant missile technology, which has a shorter burn time, the American Physical Society's Panel on Public Affairs in its report, which will be published in the next few days, assessed that the constellation size required to defend against a salvo of 10 solid-fueled ICBMs with a missile burn time of 170 seconds, using a number of optimistic and simplifying assumptions, estimated that for a system without any built-in decision-making time, so sort of an automatic launch, a constellation of 16,000 interceptors would be required for the defense against 10 solid-fueled ICBMs in a salvo launch. Given 30 seconds of decision-making time, which would compress the time available to reach the missile, that would increase the size of the required constellation to 36,000 interceptors. So that's a massive undertaking, quite expensive. But the key challenge with space-based missile defense, of course, isn't the cost, it's the fragility. Launching a larger salvo of nuclear-armed missiles would overwhelm the system. And since the interceptors orbit at an altitude of a few hundred kilometers, they would also be vulnerable to anti-satellite weapons launched from the ground on short or medium-range missiles, and vulnerable to space-based anti-satellite weapons that could be used to punch holes in the defense and thus allow the ICBMs to go through. So the second technical issue I just wanted to draw your attention to is the call out to non-kinetic techniques, including directed energy. Of course, the reach versus time challenge for boost phase defense can be alleviated somewhat if the kill vehicle mechanism travels at the speed of light. And this permits the defensive system to be stationed further from the launch site and require fewer satellites. To be viable boost phase missile defense weapons, the lasers need to be megawatt class. The executive order is mandating the development and deployment of non-kinetic capabilities for missile defense. Okay, again, largely thought to be directed energy. Does the technology match boost phase defense from space? And not right now. In practice, because in practice, a number of phenomena limit the usefulness of directed energy. To continuously focus the light beam on one spot on a moving target while the platform itself is moving over long distances requires very large, high-quality mirrors, machined to very high tolerance and very agile and stable over fast slewing rates. That technology has been developed and deployed for astronomical telescopes, but not under these stressing conditions. Of course, the mirrors would also need to be hardened against radiation from nuclear precursor bursts. Most of these technical challenges haven't been sufficiently dealt with. But to be practical, such a system needs to be light enough to be reasonably carried by a satellite, but with high enough focus power that it can disable a missile. For a comparison, the airborne laser system, which was the last boost phase defense system the US had developed, was a missile defense system designed for targeting North Korean missiles. It was a chemical oxygen iodine laser designed to be carried in a modified Boeing 747 plane. It required a mass of about 160 tons to achieve its projected 3 megawatts, plus the mass of the targeting and atmospheric correction optics. Chemical laser systems like this are operationally complex, of course, and are out of favor for these missions. The then director of the Missile Defense Agency stated that to have any hope that a system could be hosted by a long-duration aircraft, a laser system would need to require a mass of 5 kilograms per kilowatt produced. The agency's goal was to achieve 2 kilograms per kilowatt. For a reference point, the airborne laser was about 55 kilograms per kilowatt when it was abandoned as a viable concept. Current research and development has shifted away from chemical lasers to solid-state lasers, but these systems have been still at this point demonstrated to produce about an order of magnitude less power than necessary and still require an order of magnitude higher mass per power. The Pentagon's roadmap has an undetermined timeline for these technologies, at least past 2030, but none of them appear on track for being relative for strategic missile defense in the near term. While there is a real difference between putting ideas on paper and actual funding, we have seen gestures toward potentially building some space-based interceptor infrastructure in the past that didn't get beyond paper studies. I do think there's a real chance this time around that there will be money outlaid and some systems developed. I know that probably many of you on this webinar or who will watch later were probably deeply engaged in the missile defense debates in the 1980s and 1990s and have great interest in these programs, and it is clear that it needs our attention again. So thanks, and back to you, Zia.
Thank you, Laura. And I'd like to draw the attention of colleagues to the resources that Chris Rastampur, the Policy and Communications Coordinator for the Physicists Coalition, has been putting into the chat, which includes links to the various reports and references and ways to contact the speakers. So let me hand it over now to our third speaker, Xiaodon Liang from the Arms Control Association for opportunities for arms control talks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Zia. So I was asked to talk about the opportunities for arms control, so I'll give the glass half full kind of take on this. And the reason I'm able to do that is because I think really it's very hard to tell exactly how full it is and what the prospects look like, but it's important to get people to the table first. So the reason, we are all here is because, New START will expire on February 6, 2026, right? That's the pressure point that's pushing the attention back towards arms control, thankfully. So I'll discuss kind of in 4 phases of this little section, some of the considerations. So how we got here, where things currently stand, 2 types of key considerations, right? Who's going to be at these talks, and also what are the talks going to be about? What's the scope? Like, what could the scope be? So as I mentioned, New START will expire on February 6, 2026, after which there's not going to be a cap on the strategic deployed weapons of the US and Russia after that, right? So it's the 1550 deployed nuclear weapons and the 700 launchers. We go back a little bit, the Biden administration, when it came in, agreed to extend New START after the Trump administration tried its best over a year to negotiate a better treaty, which was kind of a non-starter at the time. And the US and Russia entered talks after that extension, kind of very, very early stage, just to see what could a next treaty look like. And these were, of course, disrupted by the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So after the initial shock of that war, the US arrived at the position that it was willing to talk about a follow-on treaty without preconditions. It was announced in 2023. The problem then was that at that point, Russia was kind of leveraging all of its possible tools towards its war goals, right? So it said essentially that we will not talk with you about a follow-on treaty until you drop your support for Ukraine. So essentially, there was no public discussions in the late Biden administration that we know about. of course, Russia also suspended implementation of important data sharing obligations under New START. So that's what's going on with Russia. And with regards to China, of course, it really hasn't gotten off the ground. So in late 2023, the US and China had initial discussions on arms control and risk reduction measures. And the US suggested a package of risk reduction measures that would hopefully kickstart the relationship and get the two sides kind of in the habit of making agreements with each other, sort of. And it took a while for China to reject these measures. We learned about it publicly in mid last year, but they also never scheduled a follow-on meeting. So they basically dropped the talks. And it's really hard to know whether it was for the principled reason that they gave, which is that they were opposed to US arms sales to Taiwan, whether it's because they were simply waiting out the election, or whether they don't see any purpose in the talks at all. So that's where those things stand. So today, where are things? How are things today? There are three key points that I want to make here. One is that the US and Russia will have to talk about New START. On both sides, there are reasons to do so, and they both indicated that they are interested in doing so. And so despite, all this, all the chatter about, the end of arms control and how it's not possible, it's not, there's no point to it, the two sides will talk about this. And however you feel about the US approach to Ukraine and Trump's, engagement with Putin, the fact of the matter is that they will talk about the nuclear relationship as well. Second point is that, Trump's comments on denuclearization, which Hans mentioned earlier, what should we think about this, right? And I think the position that I'm kind of taking is that we should, again, take him seriously, but not necessarily literally, right? And also, one of the key points here is that it's clear that Trump has thought about his role as a statesman in, advancing denuclearization, arms control for decades, right? So this is a recurring theme. He repeated the denuclearization remarks again that same evening after his speech to the Davos crowd. And it's not a fleeting thing, right? He's been thinking about this. And the third thing to bear in mind at the present point is that there are reasons that Russia would want to have a follow-on treaty. So anybody who tells you Russia's not interested, it's not necessarily true. The key reason for that is because, as has been for a long time, the US has a much greater upload capacity. It could put the number of nuclear warheads on the existing launchers to a much higher level than Russia could. And that gap is closing slightly, but it's still a big gap. About 3,500 US nuclear weapons on paper, right? There are other considerations versus maybe 2,600 and a little bit more for Russia, right? Putin mentioned New START, the end of New START last week, so it's on his mind as well, we know. And so that's, there are reasons they would do a treaty. So the key consideration when you think about that, the next step is who's going to be negotiating. And there's two levels to this, right? So one level is which countries are going to be involved in this. And it would be simplest if it was the US and Russia. However, the Trump administration in 2020 sought to bring China in, and this was an abject failure. They were unable to convince Beijing to participate. And China has a traditional position that the US and Russia have a unique special responsibility to reduce their arsenals first before China will join. However, the Trump administration wants to do this again. And so that's what they were advocating for. On the Russian side, going back to the Cold War, the Soviet Union always kind of wanted to negotiate about NATO's nuclear weapons together. That means bringing France and UK in. They've reiterated again that that's the approach that they want. So at least bringing France and UK in. And, this is complicated, of course, by the recent talk in France and Germany about extended deterrence, France extending its umbrella and what it would mean if the Trump administration formally, removes the US umbrella. So I think it's very indeterminate what that conversation could mean for the negotiations between the US and Russia right now. One is, of course, if French and UK forces are becoming less aligned with the US forces, maybe that eases Russian concerns, or it may be harder, right? So I think this is an area where the effects are hard to see right now. The other thing to consider is that there is already a five-sided negotiating space, which is the P5 process, which is a kind of mid-level, low-key consultation mechanism between the five recognized nuclear powers that meet several times a year. And that isn't really a grouping that has done this type of negotiation on an arms control treaty before. And it's also been stymied over the last few years. because of the Ukraine war and tensions because of that. And on another level, thinking about who's going to be negotiating, we have to consider who would Trump pick to be on his team to negotiate, which is very important because it's not clear that there are many members of the Republican defense community, nuclear community, who are that enthusiastic for denuclearization. So on some of them will tell you, yes, I can imagine a treaty with much higher numbers, or so it's hard to see what type of personality, what type of team you'd put together, whether it be just what you would expect, led by an envoy like last time, or whether it be a personally connected businessman next to Trump, right? So like the Steve Witkoffs of the world. And that matters because negotiations are difficult. It's an iterative interagency process. You have the proposals, you go back and you say, what does this mean for our strategic planning? So it's complicated. So finding somebody who is both appropriate for Trump's goals and also knows how to work with the system, that's going to be an interesting question. And the last consideration I mentioned is what is to be covered, right? So once you get to the table, what would be in the scope of a new treaty? And that's, we can kind of anticipate what these are based on historical goals of the different sides. So on the US side, the US has in the past wanted to include Russian tactical weapons. And we don't really know exactly how many there are, probably around 2,000 or less, fewer, depending on who you're relying on for estimates. And that's an area that it's possible the Trump administration would prioritize to include. Also, you would have to think about the new Russian strategic weapons that were kind of rolled out previously. For example, this idea of a long-range nuclear torpedo, right? Whether those would be included in the treaty. On the Russian side, there are concerns about US missile defense, as they've always been. So in the New START treaty text, in the preambulary text, it says that there's both sides recognize that there is an interrelationship between strategic offensive weapons and strategic defensive weapons. And given what Laura's very helpfully noted about the change in policy indicated by the new executive order, will that still be the case? Will the US still agree to recognize that? And will that raise concerns in Russia? So there's many permutations of what could be included, what could be the focus of the treaty. And for that reason, we believe at ACA, and I think the Biden administration basically came around to this view, that it would be best for the US and Russia just to agree to a freeze on their deployed weapons and continue the New START caps while negotiations continue. And hopefully on February 19th, a group of Congress, members of Congress, so senators and members of the House, send a letter over to the administration backing this approach. And it was interesting to me to see that they were able to get some centrist Democrats, leaders on nuclear issues like Angus King of Maine, to sign up to this approach. So hopefully that the benefits of this will spread over time. People recognize that that's a good, good first step, because not a lot of time is left. It's 11 months. So creating more space is really, I think, the best path forward. All right, thanks a lot, and back to Zia.
Thank you. And our final speaker today is Stuart Prager, the chair of the steering committee for the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And he's going to talk about the advocacy goals for the coalition, given the context that you've heard laid out from our other speakers. So Stuart, please.
Thanks, Zia. I'll try to be brief since we're a little bit behind schedule. So one core function of the Physicists Coalition is to reach out to Congress, to educate them about nuclear arms issues, and to advocate for policy changes that we think would be wise. So as a result of that, the steering committee for the coalition has gotten together and laid out a set of advocacy goals for the near term for 2025. Given the landscape for nuclear arms control that we just heard from the three speakers, which kind of set up my talk. In choosing the goals for advocacy, we are influenced by several factors. One common one is that advocating is a trade-off between seeking near-term changes that might be feasible but incremental, versus seeking longer-term changes which would have bigger impact, but maybe less feasible. And there's always that trade-off. Advocacy goals always have to consider what legislative bills are before Congress at the moment and maybe in the near term. And also we want to advocate for goals in particular where the voice of scientists might have a particularly big impact. We just heard about the current moment. In the current moment, congressional action is difficult to achieve in this Congress. There is a small group of congresspersons that are dedicated to nuclear arms control, but it's not large and it resides mainly in one party. We heard that the administration is unpredictable. In the last Trump administration, there were a couple of setbacks. There were withdrawals from many treaties. There were nuclear threats made to North Korea. But recently, as we heard, President Trump has made some positive comments about potential denuclearization. He said there's no reason to be building brand new nuclear weapons. We already have so many. He said that the ones we have could destroy the world 100 times over. Well, the net result of, I think, is that the actions by the current administration on nuclear arms control in coming years is highly unpredictable. As a result, our strategy for advocacy has to be kind of a living document capable of responding to developments as they arise. Our goals are guided by our mission statement, which says that we advocate for substantive changes in nuclear arsenals, force postures, and declaratory policies. And we also call for fulfillment of the obligation for nuclear disarmament, as Zia mentioned in his opening comments. So given this landscape, the Coalition Steering Committee has identified 3 goals for advocacy in the near term, and I'll just talk through them one by one. The first one sounds rather maybe conservative, but it's to maintain arms control achievements and prevent backsliding. It's clear that there's a great potential for backsliding and for going in reverse in arms control in many ways. So the first thing we need to do is hold on to the many gains that have been achieved over the years. Give you some examples of threats that we'd like to oppose. One is to uphold the ban on nuclear testing and oppose proposals to resume nuclear testing. There is a almost universally accepted international ban on nuclear weapon testing, partly backed by a treaty, partly backed by just a voluntary activity. As a result, since 1998, only North Korea has tested nuclear weapons. No other country has. And the absence of testing is an impediment for non-weapon states to develop nuclear weapons and somewhat of an impediment for nuclear weapon states to further advance their nuclear weapons. There's no need for nuclear testing. It would be dangerous, but there is now some arguments that people are given to resume nuclear testing. We also want to oppose proposals to expand or diversify the U.S. nuclear arsenal. There's talk underway with China increasing its nuclear arsenal, Russia maintaining its that the U.S. might have to increase the numbers or the diversity of its nuclear weapons arsenal. If one believes in deterrence, this would be unnecessary, but in any case, we believe that such an increase in nuclear weapons in the United States would just further fuel a nuclear arms race and increase the danger. We want to reinforce a taboo against nuclear threats and condemn any threats. Putin has recently made threats to use nuclear weapons. President Trump made threats against North Korea. Any such threat is dangerous. There had been a taboo against such threats, and they should be opposed as they arise. We want to oppose the expansion of strategic ballistic missile defense. Laura just laid out why that's technically infeasible and strategically destabilizing, but it's being pushed strongly. We want to oppose that. And finally, we want to oppose modernization, which is a big, big effort, complicated, but overall, the modernization of the U.S. nuclear force just further fuels a nuclear arms race, which is already underway. So that's our first goal, is to prevent backsliding. Second goal is to encourage, which is more positive in a way, is to encourage global engagement on nuclear weapons control and disarmament. First, we'd like to foster collaboration between scientists and civil society groups campaigning against nuclear arms buildups. We advocate as scientists on this issue, but we'd like to begin collaborating and teaming with non-scientist arms control groups, go together to visit congresspersons, and that would have a bigger impact. We also, following up on Xiaodon's talk, we want to promote, encourage meaningful measures between the US and Russia on the one hand, and between the US and China on the other hand, multilateral initiative, risk reduction. The time is right. The time is necessary to do that. That's one thing that we'll look for opportunities to advocate for. And finally, the US the coalition wants to promote the longstanding legal obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for the US to make moves, negotiating moves in the direction of nuclear disarmament. This is required by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but we would like to advocate for the US to engage with the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which has been signed by 94 states, ratified by 73 states. All of the 5 members of the Security Council that are nuclear weapon states and have signed the NPT have been moving in the direction opposite to disarmament and have not engaged with the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The US has opposed that treaty, it's shunned the treaty, and we would argue very strongly that the US should engage in discussions surrounding that treaty and engage with the merits and the consequences of the treaty. Our third advocacy goal is to urge nuclear armed states, starting with the United States, to consider the full consequences of nuclear weapons. And what do we mean by that? We have a good knowledge of the direct consequences of a nuclear detonation, of the blast waves, of the thermal flash. But we have a poor understanding of the indirect consequences, the spread of radioactivity, the effects on the global climate, the effects on the global food supply, the societal breakdowns that would follow a nuclear war. And these indirect costs can exceed by orders of magnitude the catastrophic direct effects. And if whenever someone pushes a button to launch a nuclear weapon, if it ever occurs, it's really a leap into the unknown where nobody knows what the consequences will be. So what we would advocate for is a requirement that military planners prioritize the results of existing scientific studies on the effects of nuclear use, the indirect effects that I was just describing. And to our knowledge, military planners who plan war strategy do not take into account these not well understood indirect costs, even though they could be dominating. We also would like to promote additional scientific studies on these particular indirect physical, society, and civilizational effects of nuclear weapons use, and require that these results will be considered. So those are our 3 goals, to reprise them: prevent backsliding, encourage global engagement in arms control and disarmament, diplomacy, and that military planners and others consider the full consequences of nuclear war. And coalition members are alerted to actions we would like to take, and I would just encourage all coalition members, when you get action alerts, to contact congresspersons. If you agree with the particular action, to please contribute to that action. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Zia.
Thank you, Stuart. So we have time now for some questions from folks in the audience. And so we have some questions that have already been put into the Q&A. And so some of those, I think that we can ask in open session here. And so there is one that asks about what is it that our arms control community should be doing with regard to the Chinese and the Russians insisting that there should be a link between nuclear abolition and a ban on weapons in space. So is that one of the things that stands in the way of progress on this larger agenda, given what Laura was saying is part of Iron Dome and what Xiaodon was saying about talks? So Laura, Xiaodon, do you want to take that on about connection between progress towards nuclear disarmament and the demands for a ban on weapons in space?
Well, I guess I could say briefly that given the tight connections between nuclear weapons, missile defense, and space, that they'll likely need to be treated together or very carefully prized apart to make progress. And I think this Iron Dome for space announcement really just highlights that key question, that in order to make progress in nuclear disarmament, we're probably going to have to seriously treat space weapons and missile defense at the same time. Whether it's through those treaty mechanisms that you've laid out, Alice, or some other types of agreements, I think it's clear that that's a centerpiece that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Xiaodon, do you want to comment on this linkage?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, on the ban treaty, many of us who are working on these issues are very sympathetic to it. And the question is, where is the space for us to make progress in our advocacy right now, right? And there is appetite to support the treaty in a limited set of, for example, the congressional folks that I talked to, but it's not opening it's at the margins. There's no expanding that group at present, right? So, for example, as I mentioned, there was a letter on perhaps a freeze on US and Russian weapons after New START, right? That's an area where we feel like there's space to build support for, at least a freeze for now. So that's kind of where we're pushing. But of course, I think many folks are sympathetic.
And so let me follow that up with a question that's directed to Hans. What's the thinking about getting prospects of getting the results of the National Academy study on the environmental impacts of nuclear war integrated as an input into the upcoming nuclear posture review? And let me add to that participants in the webinar may be interested in the 2023 and 2024 reports from the National Academy of Sciences study on risk analysis for nuclear terrorism and nuclear war, in which, after classified briefings, they report that the nuclear war models used by the Defense Department do not include the kinds of effects that Stuart Prager was talking about. And they say that there are no requirements in place for such effects to be studied, never mind to be included in the nuclear war modeling. And so, Hans, how do you think about that? And what's your advice on how to think about connecting the studies about the effects of nuclear war that are in existence and the studies that have not even been required of the nuclear war modelers and planners for the Defense Department as potential input into nuclear decision-making and discussions in Congress and into the nuclear posture review going forward?
Yeah. Well, that's it's an old issue, such a big issue, of course, specifically on the NPR. My sense is just that with this NPR coming up, there's very little room for sort of big changes, so to speak, in a progressive way. I think the issue of the studies about consequences, although we may reason about them and say they're reasonable, it's not something that the Pentagon is interested in getting into the NPR. And so the only sort of option I could see would be if there was a push from members of Congress that it was something that should be installed or included in some shape or form. It's unlikely to come from anybody in the administration. And so, you can make an appeal. Physicians can make an appeal, try to, do that. But it just seems to me that the most the most likely avenue for having any effect specifically on the NPR content or discussion in that would be to try to get some members of Congress to reach out specifically for that. But I really cannot assess whether that is possible, likely, all these kind of things. I just find it very unlikely that it's going to include the NPR specifically. On the broader issue of how these issues can be incorporated into the assessment, I think one interesting way to go about this would be sort of to try to start up some kind of conversation, based on these physics and these studies with people that are directly involved in the nuclear planning process, including out at U.S. Strategic Command and Joint Staff. Try to get some meetings set up with people there to discuss this issue. Not necessarily to go with them and say, you guys should really do a study on this, or you should really incorporate it, but to get a conversation going basically with them and see what comes out of that. But as you can hear, I don't have much hopes for it, but I think that kind of conversation could at least be interesting to both have views on both sides, but also learn a little more about what they say and think in turn.
So there's a question for Stuart about the new UN study on the consequences of nuclear war and how that connects to what you were saying about the need for these kinds of issues to be included in the larger conversation.
Yeah, the question is, does it answer the third goal? And the answer to that is in part, yes, the study by the UN will be a study of these indirect effects. And so that's a terrific thing, a step in the right direction. It doesn't fully solve our third goal, because connected with that would be for military planners to take those studies and other studies seriously. And that's an effect that can to be had right now. Currently, all the research, for example, on the climate change effects of nuclear weapons is supported privately. The government, to my knowledge, does not support that at all. So the government and military planners, to our knowledge, hasn't embraced the known consequences of climate effects. So the answer to the question is yes, it partly addresses the question, but not fully, because to fully address it, these studies of the indirect effects have to be embraced and considered and factored into the plans of the government.
Thank you. And there's one question that is in the chat that asks about an issue that was raised the last time there was a Trump administration, but is a perennial issue, which is about efforts to constrain a president from initiating nuclear attack because of the provisions allowed of sole authority. Are there efforts to, or suggestions for how we can think about how to constrain this going forward? Hans, do you want to have a go at that? Or Xiaodon, or Laura?
Well, we're monitoring it, and McKinsey here on our team, she's been doing a lot of work on this sole purpose stuff and talking to people about it. And it's, as you can imagine, this is an area that doesn't seem to be able to get anywhere. It's like there's a lot of debate about it. But I think right now there are two, as far as I remember, proposals in Congress where some bills have been proposed that sort of that talk about this issue and whether the U.S. should have this kind of should change the option basically for whether a president could initiate a nuclear strike without the United States having been attacked. And so, and then there are other people who want the U.S. to have a no-first policy, but it all depends who you talk to, what they think is most likely. And one of sort of the compromises I've seen suggested, and also people suggesting, is there a way that you could change the command structure, the chain of command in those scenarios where the United States have not been attacked, so that more people would have to be involved in a consideration about the potential use of nuclear weapons. And some people have talked about members from different parts of government could be part of a discussion about that, or maybe getting the Secretary of Defense directly involved in the chain of command when it comes to nuclear decisions, which the Secretary of Defense is not currently formally when it comes to launch decisions. But then again, look at the current Secretary of Defense. I don't know what the benefit would be, but nonetheless. So that's just to say there's a bunch of these ideas that are being thrown around, but we're still down to one or two specific bills that have produced in Congress. They're still there, and they could be reinvigorated, etc. Whether that's going to move the needle anywhere, that's another issue. So it's not much of an answer, but it's more just sort of description of what I think is going on.
Thank you. Laura, you wanted to intervene on this?
Hans said most of what I would say. I think there was a great deal of effort in the first Trump administration to move such a policy forward. I think so there are efforts in this community, and Hans described a number of them. I think some of the concerns are making sure that it would be durable. If it were by executive order, for example, we wouldn't want it to be overturned by another administration, and we wouldn't want this to be a political decision, but something that's really a robust, durable answer to command and control being vested in one person. And as Hans said, there are a number of different either legal or bureaucratic approaches to including other people in decision making. I think an important piece of that, though, is the speed of decision making that's required, or allowed. So I think that's like another angle that people will take into this. And we also know, well, anyway, I think that's about what I would need to say.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the politics of this, perhaps. So there was some chattering, some renewed interest in this issue in Congress after the election, right? So some offices were saying, can we do something about this? Is there some space that we can talk to the outgoing administration about this? And the problem, of course, is that, the interest in it comes and goes, right? The lack of focus on it comes and goes. And whether you are in government or not matters, right? So whether your party is in government or not matters. And so I think part of, at least part of the path forward has to be engaging candidates for the presidency early, right? This is an issue that has to be kind of on the radar, and it would help to get pre-commitments before they're even elected, right? I think that is very difficult, but is probably something necessary if this is ever going to move forward.
So thank you all. Stuart, do you have any last word to add?
Oh, well, I'm looking at the questions. I could address a question if you like, or else I just go to the end point.
Okay, so since we are now at, Hans has his hand up, so Hans, you get the last word.
Well, it's just to write on this thing about sole purpose. The sole authority. Here, I'll just urge people to think about it, not necessarily in sort of a black and white. Should the president have this or not? I think it's more, it might be more useful to sort of take it step by step and start with the most sort of problematic of it, which is whether a president could launch a nuclear strike out of the blue before the United States has been attacked. I think there's a lot more chance to get sympathy among members of Congress. That particular option is something that could be reined in a bit, rather than making a decision about whether the president should have the sole authority per se. So I'm just suggesting sort of a little tactic and trying to approach it in that way.
So thank you, everyone. We're out of time now, so I do want to remind everyone who is interested that you can join the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. Just go to our website, physicistcoalition.org, and there's a simple form to fill in, and membership is free, and you'll get information about webinars like today's, as well as a monthly newsletter about activities that the coalition is doing, as well as news updates about what's going on and the issues that the coalition engages in, and some of the things that we've discussed today. And if you have any specific questions, please just email the Physicists Coalition directly, and you can find the email address at the Physicists Coalition website and in the chat. So with that, let me wrap up. Thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you all at our next Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction webinar under hopefully more hopeful circumstances than we see in the world right now.